They called it the perfect summer, the kind of holiday that was meant to heal wounds, not open them. Emma was only 10 when she vanished. A bright, curious girl with freckles scattered across her cheeks like stardust, she had left with her dad for a week-long trip to the Scottish Highlands. Her parents were recently divorced, and the court had granted her father, Mark, a few precious days to bond with his daughter. No one expected it to be her last known appearance. The media had eaten the story alive. Missing girl on father-daughter holiday. Her father claimed she disappeared during a hike near Loch Morar. "I turned around for 1 minute," he'd told the police. 1 minute and she was gone. Search teams combed the forests, the hills, the lakes. Helicopters, sniffer dogs, volunteers. Not a trace. No body. No blood. Nothing. Eventually, the search died down. Emma became just another photo on a missing persons poster, her smile frozen in time. Her mother, Lauren, never gave up hope. But the years changed her, hardened her. Grief had a way of hollowing a person out until all that was left was suspicion. And then there was Jacob, Emma's older brother. He had been 13 when she disappeared, and the day she vanished marked the day he stopped speaking. Literally, the trauma had locked his voice deep inside. For 12 long years, he didn't say a single word. Until now. It happened suddenly in the middle of a family therapy session Lauren had begged him to attend. Jacob, now 25, taller, gaunt from years of inner torment, lifted his head and whispered, "He lied." The room fell silent. His therapist stared, wide-eyed. His mother, stunned. It was the first word he had spoken in over a decade. She leaned forward, trembling. "Who lied?" "Jacob." He blinked, his lips barely moving. "Dad," the therapist carefully pressed, "can you tell us what he lied about?" Jacob's voice cracked as though it hadn't been used in a lifetime. He didn't lose her. He left her. That was all he would say that day. But it was enough to reopen a closed case, enough to reignite a town's buried gossip, enough to make the name Mark Daniels trend again for all the wrong reasons. Lauren drove straight to the police. Jacob didn't speak again for weeks, but something inside him had shifted. He began sketching obsessively, pages and pages of dark. Trees, jagged cliffs, a little girl's silhouette against the horizon, and always the same image. A man standing behind her, watching, not helping. Investigators brought Mark in for questioning, but 12 years of time had washed away most evidence. His alibi had never quite held up, but there had never been enough to charge him. Now, though, there was Jacob, and he was finally ready to talk. But his truth wasn't simple. It was twisted, ugly, soaked in guilt. Because Jacob had known something all along. He had been the last person Emma spoke to before that trip, and the last thing she ever told him was that she didn't want to go with Dad. And he had said nothing. Jacob sat alone in his room, surrounded by the drawings he couldn't stop making, Emma's face, those woods, the cliffs. He didn't know why the memories had waited so long to break through. Maybe it was the weight of silence finally becoming too heavy to carry, or maybe he had always known the truth and just buried it, like their father had buried something else. Detectives visited him a few days later. They were gentle at first. His therapist sat beside him, and Lauren held his hand. He looked tired, older than his years, but his eyes were clear for once, like a dam had finally broken inside. "I need to tell you what happened," he said, "and what I saw." He took a shaky breath and stared at the window like it would shield him from what he was about to say. "The night before Emma and Dad left, she came to my room. She was crying. Said Dad had been weird." "Weird how?" the detective asked quietly. Jacob didn't answer right away. He was angry all the time, moody, drinking again. She said he'd been yelling at her about things she didn't understand, like Mum turning her against him. She told me she was scared to be alone with him in the woods. "And you didn't tell anyone?" the detective asked, gently but firm. "I thought she was exaggerating," Jacob whispered. "I thought he was just a bad dad. I didn't think he'd hurt her." He paused, eyes glassing over. "But then I remembered something else. After she disappeared, Dad came home 3 days later. He was acting weird. He had a gash on his hand. He said it was from the brambles. But he burned the clothes he wore. I saw him in the backyard, burning everything." Lauren gasped, tears rolling down her face. You never told me. I didn't know what it meant, Jacob said. I just shut it out. I shut everything out, but I remember now. The police took note, reopened old files, and began digging into the inconsistencies in Mark's story. The timeline was shaky. Cell tower pings were missing for a 6-hour window, and now Jacob's testimony added new suspicion, especially when they found the campsite Mark claimed he and Emma had used. It had been abandoned for years, but ground-penetrating. Radar revealed something beneath the moss-covered earth. They found a buried tin box. Inside, a tiny pink hairband, a Polaroid photo of Emma with tear-streaked cheeks, and, most chilling of all, a child's drawing, crumpled and faded with time. It showed a stick figure of a girl standing at the edge of a cliff, and a dark figure behind her, arms outstretched. Jacob broke down when he saw the picture. "She drew this," he said. "I remember her showing it to me before the trip." Now the police had more than just suspicion. They had something to dig into, both literally and figuratively. The media storm reignited. Headlines screamed, "Breakthrough in 12-year-old missing girl case." Mark Daniels, who had rebuilt his life under a new name in Dorset, was arrested at his new girlfriend's home. When questioned, he denied everything, claimed Jacob was fabricating memories. "My son has mental issues," he said on record. "He's never recovered from his sister's disappearance. Now he's trying to blame me to cope." But the evidence was stacking. Blood was found in the soil near the old campsite, traces too degraded to be conclusive, but it painted a dark picture. And Jacob, with the help of a forensic artist, began reconstructing what he remembered from that summer. A pattern began to form. Mark had been unraveling long before that trip. The divorce, the custody battle, financial troubles, and Emma, bright and observant, had probably seen too much of what kind of man he really was. But Jacob remembered one more thing, something that made his stomach twist. It wasn't just Emma who had been scared of their dad. So had he. The courtroom was packed when the preliminary hearing for Mark Daniels began. Journalists lined the back rows, pens poised, cameras flashing every time the doors creaked open. Lauren sat near the front, clutching a photo of Emma like it was the last piece of her she had left. Beside her, Jacob sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, fingers twitching on his knee like he was holding in a storm. Mark, now greyer and leaner than before, entered, wearing a cheap suit and a smirk that chilled the room. He looked at his son and ex-wife with something between disdain and boredom, like none of it mattered, like he had already rewritten the truth in his own mind. The prosecution began outlining the case. 12 years of mystery, an unreliable alibi, inconsistent statements, the burned clothes, Jacob's long-withheld testimony, the buried tin box, the drawing. The defense tried to paint Jacob as an unstable, grieving brother with repressed memories and trauma-induced delusions, but Jacob didn't flinch. When called to the stand, he spoke steadily. He told them about Emma's fears. He told them about the night she begged him not to let her go, and then, voice cracking, he said, "I should have protected her, but I was a kid, and I was scared." Of him too. The courtroom held its breath. Outside the courthouse, people began sharing stories. Neighbors who had seen Mark yell at Emma, a former co-worker who said Mark had once been suspended for violent behavior. Even a woman who briefly dated him came forward, claiming he'd been controlling and threatening. Lauren started to unravel. She had spent years blaming herself, thinking maybe she hadn't fought hard enough for full custody. Maybe she'd trusted the system too much. She had clung to hope for too long. Now that hope was being replaced with horror. The turning point came when the forensic team confirmed that the photo in the tin box had been taken only 2 days before Emma disappeared. It meant Mark had lied about when and where he last saw her. Pressure mounted. Mark's new girlfriend, unaware of his past, told police he had panic attacks whenever they passed forests or heard news reports about missing children. She said he kept a knife in his bedside table and had once muttered in his sleep, "She should have just shut up." The prosecutors smelled blood. Jacob couldn't sleep. Nightmares plagued him. He kept seeing Emma standing on that cliff, hair blowing in the wind, face turned toward him, eyes wide with fear. And behind her, always, that shadow. One night, he woke up sweating, whispering a name he hadn't said in years. Glen Torrin. It was a place, a remote part of the highlands near Loch Mora, but deeper, less accessible. Not part of the official campsite, not where the police had originally searched. He told the investigators immediately. Within 48 hours, search teams were back in the woods. What they found wasn't much. Just a piece of red fabric tangled in the roots of an old pine tree, a child's shoe half buried in the mud, and something deeper, a shallow, disturbed patch of earth near a mossy rock formation. They dug carefully. Bones, small, fragile, weathered by time but unmistakably human. Forensics would take weeks to confirm, but no one had doubts. Jacob sat alone by the window when he got the call. "They found her, Jacob," the officer said, softly. "We're almost certain. I'm so sorry." He hung up without a word. The next day he went to the cliff at Glen Torrin, the same place from Emma's drawing. He stood there for hours, staring out over the quiet landscape. And for the first time in 12 years he wept. Not the silent kind he was used to, but the loud, violent, body-shaking grief he'd buried for too long, because now he knew he hadn't just lost his sister that summer, he had lost the only part of his childhood that ever felt safe. And now, all he had left was truth. Mark Daniels was officially charged with the murder of his daughter Emma Daniels within a week of the remains being found. The forensic analysis confirmed what everyone already knew. Those bones belonged to a 10-year-old girl. The DNA matched. The red fabric was a piece of Emma's summer dress, and the timeline Jacob gave matched the estimated time of death. Mark still denied everything. "This is all made up," he shouted during a court session, his voice rising above the judge's gavel. "They needed a villain, and they picked me." But it was too late. His lies had run out of places to hide. Every time he opened his mouth, something cracked, a slip in the story, a contradiction in his memories, too much anger in his tone when talking about Emma, too little sorrow. Jacob watched it all, numb. He had stopped reacting weeks ago. Not even when his dad screamed at him from across the courtroom, "You were always weak." Always her little protector. He didn't flinch, because Jacob wasn't scared of him anymore. What haunted Jacob now wasn't just what happened to Emma. It was what came after. The years of silence, the guilt, the unanswered questions that still gnawed at him late at night. Like, what exactly happened on that cliff? The police could only speculate. Maybe she tried to run. Maybe she threatened to tell someone what he'd done or said. Maybe he lost his temper. Maybe she fell, or maybe, God help them, he pushed her. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no confessions. Just Jacob and the twisted pieces of memory he was slowly fitting together. He remembered Emma's last drawing clearly now. It had never left him. Her at the edge, him behind her. And he remembered something else, a letter. He had found it years ago, the summer after Emma disappeared. It was tucked inside a book in their attic, a folded note in Emma's handwriting. He never told anyone about it, not even his mother. But now he dug it out of a box he kept under his bed, still sealed in the plastic bag he had used to preserve it. It read, "If anything happens to me, it's not my fault. I love Mum. I love Jacob. Dad scares me sometimes. I hope he doesn't find this." It broke him to read it again, but he knew it had to be turned over. When he gave it to the investigators, their faces said it all. It was the last nail. The trial moved quickly after that. Mark's lawyer tried to claim the letter was a forgery, but experts confirmed the handwriting. The date matched the week before the trip. And the final push came when an old friend of Mark's came forward, an ex-army buddy who had gone hunting with him near Glen Torrin years ago. He remembered something Mark said one night, drunk and bitter. The woods swallow everything if you dig deep enough. Mark was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life without parole. The courtroom erupted in gasps and quiet sobs. Lauren cried quietly into her hands. Jacob simply sat there, staring straight ahead, eyes hollow. There was no satisfaction. No victory. Just silence. A few weeks later, they held a small memorial for Emma. Just family and close friends. They scattered her ashes at the edge of the very cliff where she had once stood, where her life had ended far too early. Jacob didn't speak that day, but when he stood up, holding her favorite book of fairy tales, he read the last page aloud. And the stars watched over her, and she was never alone again. Then he looked up, and for the first time since she vanished, he let himself smile. Just a little. Just enough. In the weeks following Mark's conviction, the world slowly quieted down around Jacob and his mother, but the noise inside them never really stopped. Headlines faded, the reporters stopped calling, and strangers stopped whispering when they passed by. Justice, it seemed, came with its own kind of silence. Lauren took to staying up late, staring at the window with a cup of tea she never drank. Her hands trembled sometimes, and Jacob would catch her flinching at sudden noises. Years of holding herself together had left cracks in her armor, now that the weight was gone. Jacob noticed it, and for the first time in his life, he began to feel what it meant to be the strong one. He had always thought of strength as silence, as bearing the pain alone. But Emma's voice in that letter, those few brave words she had written, made him realize it was the opposite. Real strength was truth, even when it hurt like hell. He started therapy again, not for the court, not for the investigation. Just for himself. He spoke more freely, though his voice was still quiet, always careful. His therapist, a kind woman named Helen, listened more than she talked. "I feel like I lost her twice," he told her one day. "Once, when she vanished. And again when I remembered." Helen nodded gently. "But you gave her back her voice. That's something no one else could do." The thought lingered with him. Emma had been silenced for so long, reduced to a mystery, a news headline, a missing poster. But now she was more than that again. A little girl who had been afraid. Brave enough to write a letter, brave enough to warn someone even if no one heard it in time. Jacob decided it was time people really knew who she was. He started with his sketchbook. The same one filled with those haunting drawings was now becoming something else. Portraits of Emma laughing, riding her bike, playing in the backyard, sleeping with her stuffed bunny curled under one arm. He drew her as he remembered her. Alive. Real. Lauren joined him sometimes, sharing stories Jacob had forgotten, like how Emma used to make up entire fairy tales on the spot, or how she once scolded a stranger for littering in the park like a tiny environmental warrior. "She hated when people lied," Lauren said one night, her eyes red from crying. "Even little ones." "She knew," Jacob murmured. "She always knew about Dad. She just didn't have the words yet." They made a plan together to publish a children's book based on Emma's fairy tales with Jacob illustrating it. A way to honor her, preserve her voice, and maybe, just maybe, help other kids who felt afraid or silenced. The process was slow. Some days Jacob couldn't draw at all. Other days, Lauren would stare at a sentence for hours before deleting it entirely. But they kept going, because now there was a purpose, a reason. Emma. At the book's launch, a modest local event. At the library where Emma used to beg for more storytime sessions, Jacob gave a small speech. It wasn't long, but it was honest. "My sister wasn't just a victim, she was a storyteller. She was brave and she tried to protect herself in the only way she knew how. We didn't hear her back then, but we're listening now." Applause followed, soft and warm. Later that night, Jacob visited the cliff again. Not for closure, he no longer believed in that word, but for peace, even if temporary. He sat down with his sketchbook and looked at the stars, remembering the last line from the story he had read at her memorial. And the stars watched over her, and she was never alone again. He drew one final picture. Emma sitting at the edge of the cliff, smiling. Behind her, not a shadow this time, but a figure bathed in light. Her brother, watching over her, just like he should have. The seasons shifted, summer melted into autumn, and with the falling leaves came a strange stillness that wrapped itself around Jacob and his mother like a fog. The book, Emma's Tales, from the Stars, had gained quiet attention in local bookstores and online parenting groups. A few schools even reached out, asking to feature it during awareness weeks on child safety and emotional expression. But even with the kind messages and gentle praise, something still sat heavy on Jacob's chest. Not guilt anymore, not fully, more like unfinished grief. He was walking through the local park one afternoon, the one where he and Emma used to feed the ducks, when a voice behind him called out, "Jacob!" He turned slowly. A man, mid-30s, uncertain, wearing a wrinkled coat and holding a newspaper. Under one arm. I'm Ryan McTavish. I used to know your dad," he said. "Army days." Jacob's body stiffened, but he didn't walk away. Ryan seemed nervous, eyes darting to nearby benches. "I've been following the trial. I should have said something years ago. Well, there's something I think you should know." Jacob waited silent. "We went hiking once," Ryan said, clearing his throat. "It was years ago, long before Emma disappeared, your dad. He got drunk, talked about custody, the divorce, said things like, 'She's turning them against me.' I thought it was just anger, but then he said something that stuck with me." He glanced at Jacob, regret heavy on his face. He said, "If I can't have her, no one will." I didn't take it seriously. "We were both drunk, You didn't think he meant it," Jacob finished for him. Ryan nodded, ashamed. "After she vanished, I tried to push it out of my head, told myself it was just talk. But now, I wish I'd said something. Maybe it would have changed things." Jacob looked at him, saw the fear and guilt, the decades of silence mirrored in someone else. "You were scared of him too," he said. Ryan didn't deny it. He was different when he got angry, like something snapped. Jacob nodded, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. Another piece of the puzzle. Another voice Emma had never gotten to hear. Another adult who hadn't listened when it might have mattered. Later that night, Jacob sat with his mother at the kitchen table, the old newspaper Ryan had brought laid flat between them. It was an article from the year before. Emma disappeared. A minor domestic disturbance, no charges filed. Mark had punched a hole in a pub wall after being asked to leave. "This should have been a sign," Lauren whispered. "All these little red flags." Jacob traced his finger over the words, eyes narrowing. He was already unraveling. Lauren looked at him. "But so were we in different ways." There was a long pause. "I sometimes wonder," she said slowly, "what kind of man you would have become if none of this had happened." Jacob looked up at her, tired but firm. "I wonder what kind of woman Emma would have become." That night, he returned to his sketchbook, not to draw Emma, but something new. He began a new series, not about the past, but about healing. A girl standing tall, speaking out. A boy beside her, helping others find their voice. He pitched the idea to a mental health non-profit focused on youth trauma. They loved it. Commissioned him to create a visual campaign on childhood grief and emotional safety. He accepted, not because it fixed everything, but because it meant Emma's story would keep living, not as tragedy but as warning and as hope. The nightmares didn't disappear, but they changed. Instead of seeing Emma fall, he began to see her climb, out of the woods, into the light. Sometimes she even smiled, and Jacob would wake up with wet eyes, but not from pain, from love. Months passed, and though the world outside carried on, elections, scandals, celebrity gossip, Jacob remained rooted in a slower, deeper rhythm. His drawings had found homes in therapy offices, schools, and community centers. His inbox was filled with messages from teachers, parents, even strangers, who said his art had helped start hard conversations. But despite the warm praise, Jacob felt something pulling at him. It wasn't unfinished grief anymore. It was something darker, something unresolved. Because the truth was, Mark never confessed. Even behind bars, facing a life sentence, he stuck to the same story. He didn't kill Emma. He claimed Jacob's memories were fantasies twisted by trauma, and that the letter was a plant. There had been no body, only remains, no video, no confession, only Jacob's voice and Emma's. But Jacob knew that wasn't enough for closure, not for him, so when he received a letter postmarked from the prison, with his father's name, in the return address he stared at it for an hour before opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper. "Jacob, you think you found the truth. You think you're the hero now. But memory is a tricky thing. You see what you want to see. You always did. You think you remember what happened, but you don't. You never saw what really happened. You think I pushed her. You think I buried her. You were there. You just don't remember it right. Dad Jacob's hands went cold. His stomach turned. What the hell was that supposed to mean? He took it to Helen, his therapist, and they went over it word for word. It's manipulation, she said. He's trying to plant doubt, shift blame, control you from the inside because he knows he can't from the outside. But something in Jacob twisted, not because he believed Mark's lies, but because deep down there was a blacked-out corner of his memory that had always felt wrong. He'd remembered bits and pieces, the sketchy outlines, the sounds, the fear, but not the moment, the exact moment Emma died. What if he had seen something? What if he'd blocked it out so completely the memory had never returned? He started having vivid dreams again, not nightmares, just flashes. Emma running. Through trees, her voice calling for help, his father shouting, then something new, a scream, but not hers, his. Jacob woke, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. He looked around his room, quiet, safe, real, but the dream stayed with him. Sharp, clear. He'd screamed. He was there. Just not on the cliff, but nearby. Another piece of memory slid into place the next morning when he walked past an old shed behind the house. Something he hadn't noticed in years. The smell of gasoline, burned fabric. That's where his father had destroyed the clothes. He had helped him. He remembered it. Jacob had held the lighter. 12 years old, scared, shaking, asking his dad what was going on. And his father had lied to him. She ran away, Jacob. We don't want to scare Mum. Burn this for me, all right? No one needs to know. And Jacob, terrified and confused, had obeyed. That was why the memory was buried. That was why the silence had come. Because deep down, part of him had thought he was guilty, not of hurting Emma, but of helping the man who did. He sat on the grass outside the shed, clutching his knees, heart racing. And then he whispered to himself, "He used me. He used all of us." Later that night he wrote his father a letter, not to forgive him, not for answers, but because it needed to be said. "You tried to make me doubt myself. Again. But I remember now. You made me burn the evidence. You told me to lie. You turned me into your alibi, but I'm not carrying your secrets anymore. Emma died because of you. I lived with the silence, but I won't live with the shame. This is the last time you hear from me. You don't exist to me anymore." He never sent it. He didn't need to. Just writing it was enough. Spring came early that year. Jacob stood in front of a newly placed memorial stone in the town's quiet public garden, where the cherry blossoms had just begun to bloom. The polished granite plaque read, "In memory of Emma Rose Daniels, 2001-2011. The stars watched over her, and she was never alone. There was no mention of how she died, no mention of Mark, just her name and peace. Around him a small group gathered, his mother pale but steady, Helen, his therapist, a few children holding copies of Emma's Tales from the Stars, a teacher, a social worker, quiet supporters who had walked this long road beside them, people who had once been strangers, now family in grief. Jacob read something again, this time not Emma's words, but his own. "I used to think silence was strength," he began, voice calm. "That not speaking was how you stayed safe. That if you didn't say it, it wasn't real. But silence isn't safety, it's a cage. And it grows and it hardens and it steals your voice." He paused. Everyone was listening. No phones, no cameras, just hearts open, waiting. "My sister was louder than I ever was, braver. And when she vanished, I thought I'd lost the only voice in the world that could speak truth. But she left it behind, in drawings, in letters, in memory." He looked up at the sky, the same sky she once dreamed under. "I speak now because she couldn't, and because no other child should be lost to silence." He stepped back. A hush settled over the garden, but it wasn't heavy, it was gentle, warm, like a hug wrapped in wind. Jacob wasn't the same boy anymore. He wasn't broken. He wasn't guilty. He was surviving, and that was enough. He continued his work with the Youth Foundation. His illustrated series became a teaching tool for schools and trauma centers nationwide. He created workshops teaching children how to express their fears through art. He told them, even if you can't say it, you can draw it, and someone will listen. His mother found her own healing too. She started counseling mothers of missing or abused children, using her story to help others feel less alone. She no longer sat by the window at night. She joined Jacob in planting wildflowers by Emma's stone. One day, a little girl at one of Jacob's workshops tugged on his sleeve and asked, "Was Emma your sister in real life?" He smiled softly. "Yeah, she was." "Do you miss her?" "Every day." The girl nodded solemnly, then handed him a picture. It was of a girl with red hair and a crown, standing beside a smiling boy holding a book. "She's okay now," the girl said. "She has magic." Jacob stared at the drawing, heart thudding in his chest. Then he bent down and whispered, "She always did." That night he went home, pulled out a blank page, and drew one last picture. Emma, older this time, grown, the woman she might have become, strong, smiling, alive in the way that stories make us eternal. And beside her, Jacob, still holding the book of her fairy tales, still speaking her truth, still watching over her. Hand in the stars above them, he wrote the last line they never got to finish together. She was never forgotten, and she was never alone.